Well, you know, I brought the Quran, and just footnoted here with these little post-it marks is the 8 places where there's some reference to hijab. And as you probably know, the word hijab does not mean headscarf in any one of those references. It means separation. It means a spiritual divide between us and the heavens. But then what I have here are book after book after book put forward by the government of Saudi Arabia, political movements, institutions, each one of them telling us women's dress, hijab in Islam, and scarf styling. You know, how the many different designs that you can have for the scarf. What I see in all of this is a translation, a selling of this word hijab to mean Islamically a lot of very troubling ideas. One of them, for example, here says that, relates a hadith where they then say that there will be 2 types of people in the fires of hell, and one of them will be women, especially the women who do not cover and dress properly. So all women and all people should have choice. But what's happened in my lifetime over these past 40 years is that an institution of political Islam that's called Islamism has made the headscarf a symbol of its movement. And so from Jamaat Islami in Pakistan to the Muslim Brotherhood to the government of Saudi Arabia to Yusuf Qaradawi in Qatar, they have made it so that to be a good Muslim woman, you must wear the headscarf. And of course, this doesn't reflect at all everybody's choice. But what I think is really critical to do is we always have to follow the money. We have to follow the persuasive arguments. We have to follow the publishing houses that are doing all of this. And the ultimate impact for me about all of this is the millions of women who do not have choice. So 1979, the government of Iran made it mandatory that women cover. We know what happens in Saudi Arabia. We know what's happening in Sudan now. We know what's happening in so many corners of the world. And that is what has serious impact for me, because the impact is not just about that piece of clothing that you're wearing. It's then about your access to education, to healthcare, to jobs, to all of these other issues that make women then restricted in their citizenship. Our topic is clothing and politics. And for me, the headscarf has become this symbol that has sadly taken away from women in so many communities, from Indonesia to the United States, their full citizenship in society. 2 out of 3 mosques in America, as you know, force women to pray behind a separate area, because the assumption is the same one that's put forward for why a woman has to cover her hair, that we're too sexy for our hair, we're too sexy for our butts, we're too sexy for our voice. And so for me, that has a serious, serious impact. And we as a society have decided that it's not okay. Brigham Young University right now, as many of you might have heard, is now sending women who have sexual assault cases to their honor code investigation office. We've decided as a society that women do not have the burden of honor on their shoulders. But for me, the really fundamental ethical problem with the assumption of the headscarf is that we're too sexy for our hair, and the men in this room will become so sexually aroused by seeing my hair that then they won't be able to resist themselves. And I don't have that responsibility.
So that's interesting that you bring that up, and you bring up this relationship between hijab and men. What do you think the relationship is between hijab and men versus, hijab and faith? And I want both of you guys to answer that.
It's not as important what I believe, it's what is taught. From schools in suburbs of Chicago here to Delaware, girls are taught at a very young age that they have to cover in order to be chaste, pious, and modest.
So Huda, you were in Oklahoma, you lived in
Yes.
the suburbs. Have you seen that?
I've never heard that once in my life.
Well, I can give you book after book. And
I'm sure we can have book after book after so many different ideologies, but that doesn't mean that that's what the majority of women are reading. None of my friends are like that. I'm not like that. I follow so many other, I'm a fashion blogger. I follow so many other hijabi fashion bloggers that aren't like that. People should have the right to choose, and that's what I'm talking about. I mean, it's not that, just as I'm also opposed to France banning the headscarf, that's also taking away women's rights. And if we're caring about women's rights, we should let women interpret the religion or their own personal preferences in the way that they want. And we're giving women that choice and not saying that, no, I think this person, or I picked up a book that said this, and therefore I'm going to try to make sure to vilify Muslim women who constantly are wearing the headscarf.
So I think this tactic of trying to assume that there's a vilification going on is exactly...
I don't think it's a tactic because actually just last month you went to the Department of Homeland Security and said that the hijab is, quote, on... I wrote it down.
I didn't go to the Department of Homeland
Security. On the conveyor
Security.
belt of radicalization, you are constantly working for increased surveillance of people who look like me. This is not a conversation. This is someone who is vilifying my choice to wear the headscarf.
And so let me just make a simple point, which is I didn't go to the Department of Homeland Security, so I guess you misspoke just that.
Well, maybe I guess the video that had their logo in the end also misspoke.
What I will point out is that what we are overlooking then is exactly a dynamic in which we don't want to have this conversation. Because what happens is if you actually talk about the fact that Boko Haram kidnaps hundreds of girls and then immediately puts headscarves on them because that's their ideology.
I'm against Boko Haram.
What are we supposed to do? Ignore the fact that that's actually a tactic of this political Islamic movement? What does ISIS do the minute it gets its Yazidi girls as sex slaves? It immediately puts headscarves on them because they believe this assumption that these women are too sexy for their hair.
Do you believe ISIS is representative of Islam?
Do I think what?
ISIS is representative of Islam?
ISIS is the Islamic State, and they are practicing the teachings.
They do not represent me.
Fine, that's great. I'm so glad because they don't represent me either, but they do represent their interpretation of Islam. And if we refuse to acknowledge that and continue to bury our heads in the sand, then we're going to continue to inflame this mistrust that I think leads to some of the distrust that you end up feeling.
It's not distrust, it's constant vilification.
Well, I feel it right
and
now.
I've seen it, and I've read it, and I've seen it.
I feel it very much from you right now in terms of this inability to have this conversation because what you have done is vilified my assessment of these very much issues. I mean, last week, what did you tweet out, Huda? Shit's gonna go down here at this
It's going down.
Yeah.
So I'm actually...
So what did that mean? Why does a conversation about the headscarf have to become this really difficult conversation? Because we don't want to touch these issues because they are too close to our identities. But if we don't, in any society, then we are never going to progress. We are never going to tackle these difficult topics.
So I'm going to move on to common ground.
Could I just respond to that real quickly? Thank you. So again, I'm just going to say that, so I'm a hijabi Iranian fashion blogger, and I actually constantly talk about these issues because it's important, again, as I mentioned, that the media is constantly misrepresenting us. If I didn't want to have this conversation, I would not be here. I'm here because...
Both of you identify as Muslim feminists, though you both have different views on a number of topics. How does hijab inform that facet of your identity?
I believe that being an Islamic feminist means that we fight for equal rights. So what that means is that today we fight for the right of women to have equal inheritance to their brothers. We fight for the right for women to have equal witness. And we fight for equal responsibility in society. So that means that a woman does not carry the burden of honor in society. She is not the burden of chastity. She is not the burden of piety. So what that means is that when I go into a mosque, I shouldn't have to go pray in a basement because I am a sexual temptation to the men and I am going to ruin their spiritual state. But that is the progression of what happens with this concept of the headscarf and the hijab. Everybody can define it as they wish, but the implications for us in society are very damning and very damaging. And to romanticize the headscarf, to me, is a very dangerous point. To make it a fetish in fashion blogging and fashion industry with Dolce & Gabbana putting out new abayas is very dangerous.
We're actually you mentioned Dolce & Gabbana. So a number of fashion giants, including DKNY, Tommy Hilfiger, made waves recently when they introduced modest lines aimed at Muslim women. H&M even enlisted a Muslim model wearing hijab, and Dolce & Gabbana went a step further by introducing a line of luxury hijabs and abayas, which are the long dresses that some Muslim women wear. Some viewed the trend as a long overdue acceptance of hijab and women who wear hijab in the West. Others see it as an attempt to appropriate a culture and to capitalize on the buying power of Muslims who spend billions of dollars on luxury goods annually. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've written that there's been this trend, wear a hijab day, in college campuses. Here in Chicago, it's happened. It happens all across the world right now. And I've argued that, in fact, the rest of the world needs to have an honest assessment that is outside of the arena of political correctness and walking on eggshells related to this issue, and really reflect on what the headscarf represents. To me, it represents this purity culture. It's not just the stuff of one book or two books, it's the stuff of laws. It's the stuff of criminalization in communities across the Muslim world. It's the stuff of regulation. If one person does not feel it as their motivation, that doesn't mean it's not a reality. And so what I would argue is that these fashion houses are in fact perpetuating a value system that most of us in this world have rejected, that of women carrying the burden of honor in a society.
Hoda, I see you shaking your head.
So again, I think it's important to not homogenize a group of people who choose to wear the headscarf. Again, people wear it for different reasons.
Women in Afghanistan are dying in record numbers because their husbands say that they can't be treated by a male doctor. I mean, this is the impact that is not about homogenizing, this very interesting intellectual word. It's about being realistically assess the situation in a way that is very concerned about people that don't have the same privileges that we do and the same protections that we do. And so the systematic injustices are in place now because of this assumption that a woman does not have equal rights to a man in so many of our Muslim communities. And this extends from the workplace to education, so that fewer girls are going to school in these countries. Muslim countries are at the lowest rates in gender equity rights throughout the world. We have a real crisis, and we should be really honest and deep about it rather than skim the surface.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly. I think it's almost ridiculous to say that we're going to blame all of a social inequity in a country based on Muslim people, when in fact we can look at American imperialism for that. We can step out and look at what's causing poverty in different countries. We can't say that Islam is causing poverty in different countries. We can look at American imperialism. We can look at all these different factors that are constantly causing people to be in these situations. And just on the point of Muslim women being less educated, in Iran, actually, there are more Muslim women in universities than men. In fact, there were so many Muslim women in universities that they had to set a quota so more men could get into university.
Do you think that there's pay equity in Iran of any level?
Actually, yes. I was in Iran and I asked my aunt, and I was like, can you believe that in the United States, women and men aren't paid, women paid less? And they're like, that's absolutely absurd.
It's one of the lowest pay equity places in the world. And
it might have been. But we can't blame this on a religion.
But we can blame it on Western imperialism.
Right now, there's a huge poverty.
One of the issues that really dominated Chicago headlines recently was the decision by a Wheaton College professor to wear hijab in solidarity with Muslim women after reports surfaced that Muslim women were being attacked. Asra, you co-wrote a piece in the Washington Post where you asked non-Muslim women not to wear hijab in solidarity because doing so, and again, this goes back to the point that you've brought up a number of times today, promotes a, quote, dangerous purity culture obsessed with honor and virginity. The piece gained a lot of attention. I think last time I checked, there were over 1,000 comments on it. Were you surprised by the positive and negative response that you got? There's a lot of criticism that you don't speak for Muslim women, and that there were those who argued that you were casting hijab as a whole as backwards, and those who wear it as supporting an oppressive culture. Although I know you said in the piece that you support a woman's right to wear or not to wear hijab.
Yeah, I don't think that we've gone off on side issues. I think that these issues about women's citizenship is very much related to the topic at hand, which is politics and clothing. Ultimately, the clothing has this deep impact. And on your point, I would argue that that piece and the response that I received and the response I'm receiving right now is emblematic of the fact that we don't want to have these kind of conversations. From Chicago, I got, from a Chicago Muslim leader, a response that I was clinically delusional because I dared to have this conversation.
But I know that I've read a number of blogs and articles and heard panel discussions of people talking about this very issue. What should we do about hijab? Is hijab obligatory? How is hijab helping Muslim women? So I don't think that we're not having that conversation.
Well, I've got to tell you that the response to that article was just shocking to me because it really reflected to me how the idea of putting forward this argument that it is actually a manifestation of a political movement in Islam is something that people don't want to talk about. And what I really recognized also is that there's just a battle for authority in our community. So ultimately, having dissent and having any kind of conversation about interpretation that has been put forward by governments, the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Qatar, this causes a real problem for us. And on deeper issues, most importantly to me, the issues of extremism within our communities. I'm a reporter, I'm a journalist. My task as a Muslim has been to investigate how it is that we are engaging in some of the practices that we're engaging in today. So I do my research, I do my reporting, just like we do on any beat that we have anywhere in the world. And what I have found is that, in fact, there is very much this multi-million-dollar industry that is trying to put scarves on our heads for an ideological agenda. Now, that doesn't mean if I choose to go to McDonald's, I'm going to say that I went there because I've gotten the receiving end of a marketing campaign. But McDonald's is engaged in an aggressive marketing campaign for our dollars. And in the same way, these governments are in a very aggressive marketing campaign for our hearts and minds. We are in a struggle for the soul of Islam, and we are actually the foot soldiers in this. I can't speak to any individual human being's motivation, but what I can speak to is the machinery, and there's a very serious machinery that we should acknowledge.
But when you cast such a wide net, when you're talking about hijab, and you catch such a wide net, how do you respond to critics who say that you're denying the agency of Muslim women who choose to wear hijab, not because they're brainwashed, not because they're buying into this, ISIS mentality or this, extremist mentality?
Well, I think that is the perception of people who do not want to have the conversation about this machinery that's out there. Because when we assess, when we describe, when you do any reporting about a policy change and the behind the scenes that's going on, you're not going to have a conversation about each of the people that's being impacted as actually buying into the architects of that policy change. They haven't had anything to do with it, but they're on the receiving end of it. And so when this characterization happens, I think it really is a poor reflection on what it is that I'm actually trying to do, which is demystify the headscarf and actually talk about it in terms of this machinery that's been put out there. The Global Hijab Day campaign is put forward and promoted by an Iranian TV station that puts forward the idea that a woman is aura or forbidden from public eye and from public consumption. This isn't just the stuff of the receiving end.
So you're going back to this concept of, of women being forbidden, and that being the nature of hijab, and that being, the consensus on why women wear hijab. But Huda, you're saying that that's not the case.
Can I just clarify something?
Sure.
I think what is being done is I am talking about the people who are selling this idea. How can I possibly speak about the individual who is putting the scarf on? I can't get into people's heads. I don't know why they're doing what they're doing. But this turning it around to try to say that I am speaking about that person's intention is a very convenient way to try to discredit any of the analysis that I've done and any of the analysis related to this machinery by these governments. And they have their own operations, and they don't want to have this conversation. So whenever there's a conversation about Islamic extremism, they turn it into Islamophobia because they don't want to have a conversation that makes them, that holds them accountable for the theology that they put out in the world.
Really quickly.
So I'm from Kenya, and there are a lot of laws on the books that are discriminatory against women. We couldn't blame them on Islam, but we could blame it on being a poor country, which is why we have UN women programs out there. But also, since I've moved to the US, you see misogyny rife everywhere. They are Hillary Clinton nutcrackers. And at the University of Chicago, where I'm a student, I once had a friend who was the only woman in an honors math class told by a classmate she could just sleep with a professor for a grade. So my question is, in terms of thinking about the machinery that you're analyzing in the context in which you're analyzing it, isn't it important to consider that this audience is ready to hate the hijab in a way that they are not ready to face American imperialism, for instance, something that Hoda had pointed to. In thinking about where our analysis falls, is it not important to remember that people at the margins are already always under erasure? And how do you deal with the fact that those identities are sort of vulnerable to attack in these ways and are vulnerable to becoming the machinery along which oppression happens, even when the conversation could be more robust in a different context, choosing different points of analysis?
To your point, I would argue that, in fact, the governments of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran are more responsible than the US for the problems that Muslims face today. The reason that we are mistrusted when we are is because we have a scourge of extremism that is plaguing our world today, that is spilling blood from San Bernardino to Brussels, and our inability as a Muslim community to eliminate that extremist ideology, including forced headscarves and all of the other misogyny that occurs against women, is more responsible than all of these other issues of deflection that are basically excuses to avoid dealing with the problem.
Yeah, I'm Turkish. I go to the University of Chicago. So I've felt really patronized during this discussion because you mentioned at some point that Muslim women aren't willing to sit down and have these conversations. To do what exactly? To like get rid of hijab? I don't know. But there's like so many, I have so many questions.
So let's just try to wrap it up and just get one last question.
So I have a question about, you mentioned mandatory headscarf, where we have a verse in the Quran that says there's no compulsion in religion. And then you talked about equality of like women's inheritance, which is Islamic jurisprudence and all that. And then
So we want to make sure that we stay on topic to hijab. So do you have a question about hijab
so,
for our panelists?
Since there's a command by God, right, for both men and women, and in the Quran, for men it comes first, there is a certain type of modesty that has to be there, and this is God's word, as we believe. And you seem to disagree with a lot of the theological content of Islam. Why are you still Muslim?
So what we just witnessed was what we call the elimination of anybody's credibility when they want to apply a concept of ijtihad or critical thinking. It is so typical to try to drive that critical thinking out of our community. And who suffers? We suffer. We suffer when we don't have these kind of conversations. And I would argue, in fact, that we have created the mess that we're in today. We can try to blame everybody else. We can try to be wound collectors, collecting wounds that go back to the Crusades, that go back to every war that the West has ever waged. But we are responsible for our own problems. And until we actually eliminate an ideology that treats women as second-class citizens from issues of our bodies as vessels for honor in our community, becoming excuses then for our subordination, then we will never move forward in the 21st century. And why do I believe that we must do it? Because Islam was founded on principles of progressive values. And that's the kind of values that we need to fast forward into the 21st century.